Hello and welcome to this supplemental video as part of my Udemy course. We want to go verse by verse through Romans 12. And so Romans 12 is the beginning of the second main section of Romans. The first part is like the teaching, and now we get to the preaching. So if all this theological stuff in 1 through 11 is true, then 12 through 15, this is how you should live. And so let's go ahead and look at Romans 12, verse 1. And I'm looking at interlinearbible.org if you're watching the video version, which if you're in the Udemy course, you are. There is a podcast version of this on Patreon, patreon.com/Ken Schenk, if you want to hear it. Okay, so therefore, when you see a therefore, ask what it's there for. Therefore can either conclude or therefore can say, let's move to the next step. This is a let's move to the next step, therefore. So given all this, Romans 1 through 11, let's go to the next step. Now, in the Udemy course, following Scott McKnight's thought, we are moving backwards because I feel like if you have the end in mind, then when you read the theology in the first 11 chapters, you're not just abstracting it, but you see that this theology had a purpose. It had a argumentative, I don't mean that in a negative way. It's making a point in the context. And in many respects, reading Romans 12 through 15 before we read 1 through 11 helps us see what the point was. Because here's the point. Here's the takeaway. Now for the takeaway. Therefore, I encourage you, I beseech you, I exhort you, brothers and sisters, because masculine would have been the umbrella for men and women, through the mercies of God, compassions of God. This is God's mercy to us, that we can even do this, that God's even letting us do this is part of his mercy. To present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable, your reasonable worship, your logical worship. Okay, so present your bodies. As you've seen in the course, we did a kind of at one glance all of Romans. You can see that this is building upon something that was in chapter 6. In chapter 6, Paul says, do not present your members, your body parts, as instruments of unrighteousness, but present your body parts as instruments of holiness. Again, this is not theoretical. This is not theological. Well, it's really Jesus presenting his body parts. I can do whatever I want. No, it's actually in how you live. Present your bodies to God. Give them to him. Present your skin, your flesh, to God, so that you can get out of your skin, as it were. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Get out of your skin, get out of your bodies, as it were, and live a spiritual life. I'm exaggerating the dualism, but there is dualism here. And he's saying, take your body, your skin, your flesh, that is a source of temptation and leads you into sin. Present your body as a living sacrifice. Put it on, is your all on the altar of sacrifice laid? Give it to God, so that you can live the life that's pleasing to God. As we will say over and over and over again in this course, this is about actual righteousness in a person's life. Present it holy, that means it belongs to God. Pleasing, so it's not pleasing if your body does sinful things. It is your reasonable worship. Now, this is a phrase, it's translated differently in different translations. Your spiritual service, your spiritual worship. What does this mean? Well, the word logikos, reasonable, has I suspect, a lot of background to it. There's a lot under the iceberg here. This is what is fitting. This is what is appropriate. I don't think spiritual quite captures it. I'm not sure why the NIV goes with that. It is the right thing to do. It is in keeping with the harmony of the universe. It is your reasonable latreia. And this word has to do with, it's not just service in kind of, I'm going to go do a service project. We're going to pick up some trash off the lawn. That's great. Please do. But this is a liturgical kind of worship, I think, service. It's about the appropriate service to God. So this is the way we serve our God, serve our God, serve our God. This is our logikane latreia. This is our reasonable worship. Okay, verse 2. And do not be systematized. Don't be, that's anachronistic, but anyway, it is the word. Is it? No, it isn't. It isn't the word. I made that up. It's not that way. So schematized. Do not be conformed, basically. Do not take the shape of. Do not take and again, I'm doing the etymological fallacy now. Do not be conformed to this age, but be metamorphosized. I'm doing it again. Be transformed by the renewing of the mind. In order that you might demonstrate, you might prove, you might ding, you've got righteousness, in order that you might demonstrate what the will of God is. What will of God are we talking about here? The good will of God, the pleasing will of God, the complete will of God. Perfect will of God. I think the word perfect just sends us off on rabbit trails in English. And so I think complete probably will keep us more in tune with what Paul is saying here. Now, this verse in Christian traditions that tend to be very heady and cognitive, they immediately talk about worldview. They immediately talk about presuppositions. They begin to talk about having the right ideas. And I want to say that's part of it here. But that's not, basically, what is he saying? If you want to know what is Paul talking about, when Paul talks about a transformed and renewed mind that is not conformed to this age, what does he mean? Does he mean that you pass the test when you true, false, multiple choice? I got it right. Is it about a heady cognitive thing? Is it about having the right ideas or a worldview in terms of ideas? Well, if we read on in Romans 12 and 13 and 14 and 15, this is what we call a general statement. These are the key verses. Romans 1 and 2 are the key verses of the second half of Romans. In good old Asbury Seminary language, we would say these verses are particularized in the rest of Romans 12 through 15. That is, Romans 12 through 15 plays out what this looks like. So if you want to know what it means to have a transformed and renewed mind, read on. If you want to know what it means not to be conformed to this age, read on, because we're about to find out. And what we're about to find out is that it's not so much about your ideas or ideology. It's not so much about your theology. It's about your attitude. It's about your frame of mind. It is about the way you relate to other people. More than anything else, when you read these next few chapters, it's about human interrelationships. It's not even primarily about our relationship with God. If you read 12, 13, 14, 15, Paul focuses on how we live with each other. And of course, in Romans 13, there will be a general statement that generalizes this whole section and says that the one who loves their neighbor has fulfilled the law. Paul doesn't even mention loving God, by the way. I mean, I think he would agree. If you say, Paul, shouldn't we love God too? Oh, of course, yeah. But that's not what's on his brain. That's not what's in the bubble above his head. That's not what he's picturing in Romans 12, 13, 14, 15. He's talking about human interrelationships, both interrelationships with each other and interrelationships with the world, even interrelationships in chapter 13 with the state, with the empire. And so if you want to know what a transformed mind is, Paul emphatically demonstrates that it's not primarily about ideas or theology or worldview in an intellectual sense. It is about the way we relate and treat each other. I'm sorry, that's just what it is. It's going to be clear. We're going to slam dunk that point when we read on in this chapter, because there's no debate. It is crystal clear. That's just not what Paul is talking about here. And so there's a kind of a blind spot here for those who see this transformed mind. That's right, we're going to talk about presuppositions. That's just not what he's talking about here. Again, I'm not denying that that's important. I'm not denying that that's true. I'm simply saying that's just not what this verse is about, primarily. It's overwhelmingly about our attitude toward each other. You want proof? Well, here comes the proof. Verse 3. For I say through the grace that was given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to be high-minded above what it is necessary for you to think. Don't think more highly of yourself than you ought. So again, is this about ideas? No, it's about how you think about yourself. It's about not being prideful, condescending. It's not about, well, I'm the best thing since sliced bread. And by the way, I guess sliced bread was pretty good when it came out. I read a testimonial this week, And when sliced bread came out, that was like the greatest thing ever. Well, don't think more highly of yourself than you ought to think. And there are probably some people out there think, well, I should think highly of myself. I'm wonderful. I'm a delight, as Sheldon says on one TV show. But anyway, don't be high-minded. Don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to. And of course, how should we think of ourselves? You may have heard the expression, I am third. God first, others second, me third. I'm last. So you want to know how not to think more highly of yourself? Put yourself third. Then you have a renewed mind. Then you have a transformed mind. When you're number 3, you have a transformed mind. Hard to do, but that's what Paul's saying here. But to think in order that you're sober-minded, so you're very reasonable in your estimation of yourself, to each as God has allotted a measure of faith. Now we're going to talk about interrelationships in the church. This is Paul's version of 1 Corinthians 12. And by the way, Paul's at Corinth while he's writing this. I think that Paul would have been talking about Romans. In fact, I'm sure the church at Corinth got a foretaste of the book of Romans before the Romans did. And so this is not just for the Romans. This is a nudge, nudge, wink, wink. You Corinthians, listen to me. I mean, how much better? It's kind of like Nathan telling David about himself without David knowing it. Paul is talking to the Corinthians about them too. And so this idea of getting along with each other is not just for the Roman church, but I think it's also for the Corinthian church as well. Verse 4, for just as in one body we have many members, and the members all, do all the members have the same function? Do they not all have, okay, sorry, this is not a question mark. I'm sorry, this is a Greek moment. The members all do not have the same function. So we should not think that we all should do everything in the church. There are some individuals who think, well, I'll do that. Well, I'll teach that. Well, I should be in charge of that. I'm the best at that. There are individuals who think they're the best at everything, and some of them may be better at some things than others. But there is this give and take in the body of Christ. It's not just about who's best. It's about what is best for the body. The others comes before me. The building up of others comes before my freedom, even. And so there is this submission to one another, submitting to one another, as Ephesians 5 says, submitting to one another. So also, verse 5, so the many, just as we are many, we are one body in Christ, and members of each of one another. And so we are the same body. There are individuals who are stressed out and they damage their own body. This is a phenomenon, but that's not healthy. That's not the way the body's supposed to function. We don't chop off our fingers. We don't poke our eyes out. I mean, that'd be horrible. And so why do we do it to each other in the church? We shouldn't do it to each other in the church. And if we have a renewed mind, if we have a transformed mind, we don't treat each other that way. But we recognize that we are one body. We have many members, and different members of the body do different things better than others. Verse 6, but having gifts according to the grace that has been given to us, different ones. Again, this is very similar to 1 Corinthians 12. Whether prophecy, according to the proportion of faith. This expression, the analogia tes pistuos, the analogy of faith. That's an expression that would become important in later church history. It has a sense here, though, of proportion, the proportion of faith. To the extent you have faith, some have the gift of prophecy. Some think they have the gift of prophecy, but don't, of course. There are people who like, and I may be one of them, I apologize if I am, those who like to kind of tell off the church, tell the church what's wrong with them. There are a lot of them on Facebook, a lot of them on Twitter. I'm going to tell you all what you should do. But there are individuals who have a genuine prophetic voice. I heard a sermon this morning by Steve Deneff, who's my pastor at College Wesleyan Church, calling the church to a kind of third order of simplicity and fidelity and submission to one another, and in a way that influences the world. I thought it was a potentially prophetic sermon this morning. I don't feel that way about many sermons, but I felt that might be quite significant. The movement that he is, I don't know that he's trying to start a movement, but he's preaching something that could start a movement. So if you are a prophet, if you have a word from the Lord, a prophecy, then God has given you a gift, and you should use it according to the proportion of your faith. This analogy of faith, that as God has given us faith, so God doesn't expect us necessarily to act in discord with the amount of faith we have. I think that might be an inference here. That's a whole intriguing line of thought. Some people have more faith than others. There's a gift of faith, for example. Obviously, our faith can increase. I think the disciples asked Jesus to increase their faith. And so there's nothing wrong with growing our faith, but there's a sense of proportion, I think, implied. It's explicit in this verse here. Prophecy in proportion to our faith, and Lord, increase my faith. Verse 7, whether it's service, diakonia, this word deacon comes from this. If service is what the Lord has gifted you with, then in service we act in accordance with the grace God has given us. And he may very well have people like Phoebe in mind who served the church. I have a sense that the deacons, when I think about the structure of the early church, I have a hunch that the elders served a little bit like a church board do today, and that what we call the deacons weren't actually secondary ministers, but may actually have been the real ministers in the church, the ones that did the legwork in the church, the ones that ran the errands, maybe the ones that made the things happen. The elders may have given leadership, and they probably were elders, and they were probably equivalent to what were overseers. So ministry here, Timothy is a minister, a servant, as it's often translated. So that's a question about whether our later developments in church structure have infected what we take a deacon to actually be. The deacons may have been more of the active ministers in local congregations than we might at first suspect. Whether it is teaching in the teaching. Some people are gifted with teaching. And then some, like me, make videos. Verse 8, whether in exhorting in the exhortation. Paul gives an exhortation. These are preachers in some respects. Paul picks up, at, where is it? Iconium? I forget exactly where he's at, where he preaches in Acts 13, but he gives a word of exhortation. Hebrews is a word of exhortation. So there are exhorters, there are preachers. In giving, in generosity. In leading, with diligence. In showing mercy, with cheerfulness. And there are individuals who have resources. I think Paul, again, I'm not saying there's a contradiction, but Paul is not like Jesus and James toward money. Jesus and James aren't real positive toward the wealthy, just to be frank about it. Paul accepts that there are individuals with resources. In fact, he's probably one of them, at least in a former life. And so Phoebe is a patroness of the church of Cenchrea. There are individuals with resources. Lydia was a person with resources. Notice how women feature in the book of Acts and apparently in Paul's ministry as patronesses. This is a dynamic that eventually becomes problematic, perhaps at Ephesus, where you have what 2 Timothy calls weak-willed women. I think it's in chapter 3. But there are individuals with resources, and they serve the church with their generosity. There are leaders that lead, synagogue leaders, for example, we hear about. And then there are those who are very good. They're both in a position to show mercy, and they have the attitude. What is a renewed mind? A renewed mind wants to give mercy. A renewed mind doesn't say justice. Vengeance is mine, Paul's going to say in a second, saith the Lord. There are individuals who don't have a renewed mind in the church who want to make sure people get their just desserts. You need to get what you have coming to you. And so again, what is a transformed mind? What is a renewed mind? What is a mind that is not conformed to this age? It is a mind in which we yield to each other, we submit to each other, we honor those who have certain gifts, and we yield to them, and we exercise the gifts that God has given us. Verse 9, let love be unhypocritical, because there are people who pretend to love others, but they really don't. And of course, in our day and age, I think we're very attuned to flattery and things like that. I think, the younger you are, the harder it is to deceive you. For whatever reason, it seems like the older generations were more gullible when it comes to politicians, and maybe still are. I don't know. Maybe that's part of age, is that you become gullible with politicians. I don't know. But let love be unhypocritical, abhorring what is evil, cleaving to what is good. This is a transformed mind. Verse 10, let brotherly love, in brotherly love towards one another, devoted in honor, esteeming one another. Again, what is a transformed mind? It's loving toward others. It's being devoted to the honor of others. It is esteeming others. Verse 11, in diligence, not being lazy, in spirit, being fervent, being alive, serving the Lord, rejoicing, verse 12, rejoicing in hope, being patient in tribulation, being holding fast in prayer. Again, this is a transformed mind. This is what it looks like. It's not about, do you have the right theistic presuppositions? Although it's great to have theistic prepositions, that's just not what Paul's thinking about. It's not what's in the bubble of his head when he talks about a transformed mind here in Romans chapter 12. So, rejoicing in hope, being patient in tribulation, not let's make sure that we take over the world for Christ. No, being patient in tribulation, being holding fast, being constant in prayer. Verse 13, contributing to the needs of the saints and pursuing hospitality. Again, we take care of one another. We do good to the people of God. When you have resources that can help others, you help others who are in genuine need. That's what a transformed mind looks like. Verse 14, bless the ones who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Now we're heading into a stretch of chapter 12 that sounds an awful lot like Jesus. And so we have, it raises the question, is Paul consciously passing on Jesus tradition here? People have often wondered, why doesn't Paul quote Jesus more? Well, this is a section where Paul may very well be passing on Jesus tradition. Bless those that persecute you, don't curse them. This turn the other cheek stuff here doesn't sound a lot like what some Christians would say today. Verse 15, rejoice with those who are rejoicing, weep with those who are weeping. Again, we don't look at them, they're suffering. They needed to suffer. They, we can feel a sense of payback, and I'm glad they're crying because they need to cry some. That's the attitude some have. It's a human thing. It's part of our fallen human nature. It should not be part of that's being conformed to this age. That's this world. That's worldly thinking. Worldly thinking curses curses back when you're cursed at. That's worldly thinking. To be sad when other people have good things happen to them, that's worldly thinking. To weep when good things happen to others, that's worldly thinking. Christian thinking rejoices with those who rejoice, weeps with those who weep, blesses when they're cursed. Verse 16, thinking the same thing toward one another, not thinking haughty, arrogant things. Again, we're hearing echoes of Philippians as well here, which I think Philippians was written from Ephesus, so it's, again, in the same general time period. Not being high-minded, as they say, but going along with the humble ones, with the lowly ones. Again, identifying with the hard luck case, identifying with the people on the margins. This is very Jesus-y, very Sermon on the Mount-y in this section here. The underdog. Do not be wise in yourselves. Others don't think, well, yeah, why don't you ask me? Because I know everything about everything. Verse 17, to no one, repaying evil for evil. Right, again, that's the human, but that's not the Christ follower. Providing right things before all men. So this is a bit of a strange statement. Let me think about it for a second here. Okay, so pronoeo, thinking ahead of, planning for good things. So intending good things, right things, beautiful things before other men. So you want the good to happen to others, not the bad to befall others. 18, if it is possible from you, being at peace with all people, not just other Christians, but being at peace with the world, living at peace with all people, not being a contentious person. There are people that always are causing contention. They're the people you don't want to invite out. They're going out to dinner, but you don't want them to come because it'll just mess up the mood. Anybody like that? Individuals who just cause strife. When they're around, at some point in the fellowship, it's not going to be fellowship. If they're around, at some point, everything's going to get tense and uncomfortable. And they don't know it. They think they're wonderful. Living at peace with all people, and that all includes non-Christians. So this is not just about your attitude toward the Christian church. This is about loving everybody around you, as Jesus makes very clear in the Sermon on the Mount. Verse 19, not avenging yourselves, beloved ones, instead give place for wrath. For it has been written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. What does it mean to give place for wrath? It is don't take this is God's business. Don't take God's place. Leave a little place for God to bring about justice. Don't be the one, don't be Batman. I'm going to go make sure justice happens, whether the law does it or not. Leave place for God's judgment. Judgment is something that God claims. It is not our business. Judgment is God's business. I believe Paul is quoting Deuteronomy here, the Song of Moses, I think. Verse 20, but if your enemy should be hungry, feed him or her. If he should thirst, give drink to him. For in doing this, you will heap coals of fire upon his head. This is a quote, I think, from Proverbs, at least the heaping coals. Again, I don't think this is just talking about other Christians, that you shouldn't have enemies in the church. And as I've mentioned, Paul says, live at peace with everyone here. Other Christians should not be cursing you. And Jesus, when he uses an example in Matthew 5, he says, God sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. God sends sun upon the righteous and the unrighteous. It's clear in that passage that Jesus is not just talking about loving your enemies among the church, but the example says that he's talking about the whole world. And I think that's what this passage also indicates. He's not just talking about within the church. He's talking about enemies in the world, especially the ones who can really cause harm and the ones who may need justice. The heaping coals of fire. This is a curious phrase. I always, whenever I come to this passage, I always ask myself, what does that mean? I mean, we have a sense of it, right? That heaping coals of fire has a sense of, they realize, what am I doing here? This person's being nice to me, and all I am, I'm a jerk to them, and this person is only nice in return. And whatever heaping coals of fire means, it's kind of like a burden on a person that says, I'm wrong here. I've got to apologize to that person. I think we have a good sense of what the expression is getting at. Question is, what does this expression mean? Now, of course, it may be that it was in the water. I mean, we have expressions like this that we don't think about. I can try not thinking of one offhand, but every once in a while, I'll realize, hey, that's a strange expression, like a wild goose chase. I think I was in my 20s, probably maybe even 30s. I may have been in my 30s before I thought, chasing a wild goose. Oh, I get it. That's funny. I use the expression all over and over again without thinking about what it meant. And so we shouldn't necessarily assume that Paul, that there's some deep meaning behind the expression other than it was a cliche, an idiom that Paul knew. But there are possible sources for it. I've heard it suggested that there was some Egyptian ritual where they had a pan of coals on their head that implied, repentance. I think in general we don't know for sure. I mean, we like to nail it down and say, well, here's what's really going on here. I'm not sure we 100% know exactly where the expression came from. And since it's coming from Proverbs, it could have been a idiom by the time of Proverbs. And so especially by the time of Paul may have no idea where that expression comes from. We know what it means, even if we don't know its origin. Verse 21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. This is, again, a part of Paul's writings that sounds the most like Jesus probably of any of Paul's writings, and he may be passing on some Jesus tradition here. We get the point, right? This is what a transformed and renewed mind looks like. This is what not being conformed to the world looks like. It's not about presuppositions, although that's part of it. It's about loving your neighbor and enemy as yourself. That's what a transformed mind is. Overwhelmingly clear. I don't see how there's any debate. You have to rip Romans 12:2 out of context to make it mean what so many make it mean. Again, I'm not saying that it doesn't involve ideology as well. Sure, it involves ideology as well. That just wasn't the ideology in Paul's head when he wrote this. Paul has in mind the way we live and the way we treat one another. More transformed mind next week with Romans 13.